This special session is just the latest example that shows instead of fixing what Tennesseans actually want, some politicians are only consumed with fixing the results of elections to hoard power. I'm asking you to do the right thing and vote this down. We know y'all don't want to do this. I've heard from a lot of folks who have been talking to their communities and they don't want to do this. I'm seeing folks post surveys on Facebook. Y'all don't want to do this. And so stop sticking with Republican leadership and vote no.
Okay, so the Senate and the House here in Tennessee have passed the legislation that would redraw and redistrict the congressional maps here in Tennessee. I mean, we have protesters that are still here right now. I mean, they have been here since Tuesday. They have been here throughout the week.
What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? You stupid mother.
People are calling integration white supremacy now. Let that sink in for a second. The Tennessee state capitol got flooded with protesters this week, as you guys can see on the screen. We'll get to that clip in a minute. Because Republicans withdrew congressional maps after the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot rely heavily on race to draw congressional lines. Tennessee followed the law and people lost their minds. That's where we are in 2026, fighting to keep racially segregated voting districts while calling the people who ended them racist. So today we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it happened, and why the real story is nothing like what you're seeing in the headlines. Tennessee's 9th congressional district sat right in the heart of Memphis. For decades, that district was drawn specifically so that black voters made up the majority of its population. That's what a majority-minority district is. A district where the lines were deliberately shaped around race so that one racial group holds the numerical majority inside it, meaning hold most of the votes to win that district. So think of it like a school lunch table where someone decided exactly who sits where based on what they look like instead of who lives in the same neighborhood, the community, right? The idea came out of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. One of the most important pieces of legislation this country ever passed, and understanding what that law was actually designed to do is the key to understand why this whole debate is so backwards right now. The Voting Rights Act was born out of real documented systemic abuse. Black Americans in the South were being blocked from voting through literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and outright violence. The Edmund Pettus Bridge wasn't symbolic, it was the site of state troopers being peaceful marchers on national television in 1965 because those marchers wanted the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act was the direct legislative response to that. Its core purpose was to protect ballot access, meaning every eligible citizen gets to walk in, cast a vote, and have that vote counted, no matter the race. That's it. Full stop. What it was never designed to do was guarantee that a specific political party wins a specific congressional seat. Those are two completely different things, and that distinction matters more than almost anything in this conversation. Think of it this way. The right to play in the game is protected. What was never supposed to be guaranteed is that one team automatically wins every single season before the players even step on the field. Your right to vote is protected. What is not guaranteed and what was never supposed to be guaranteed is that your votes get funneled into a single district, meaning get packed, so that the math automatically produces a win for one party every single cycle. And that's what majority-minority districts eventually became in practice. Politicians figured out fast that if you pack enough voters of one type into one district, that seat becomes a guaranteed win. It's like if someone rigged a vending machine to only ever drop one specific snack no matter what button you press. The politician in that seat stops having to campaign hard, stops having to solve real problems in communities, which, beautifully, we have diverse communities being unified more than ever, and communities are so more diverse now, and we have come so far, which is a beautiful thing. And I'm not saying that our country's history was perfect. No country is perfect, but we have come a long way. We are more all together now, no matter the race. And when you look at that, right, If the politician in that seat stops having to campaign hard, stops having to solve problems for the communities that they're supposed to represent, stops having to compete because the outcome is basically locked in before a single ballot is cast, that's not representation. That's a reservation system for politicians. So when the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot overly rely on race to draw congressional maps, Tennessee Republicans moved, and they had every legal tool to do it. Republicans in Tennessee control the state house, the state senate, and the governor's mansion. That's called the trifecta, which means they have full legislative authority to make exactly this kind of decision. They withdrew the 9th district's line so that Memphis, instead of being its own racially packed congressional island, now shares political geography with surrounding communities, no matter the race, meaning actually keeping the power within the community and who lives in those communities, not based on the race and packing, not being it racially focused, but actually community focused, no matter who lives in that community, no matter the race. Black voters in Tennessee still have every single right they had before this map change. They can register, they can vote. Their votes are counted. What changed is that their votes are no longer being deliberately concentrated into one geographic pocket to manufacture a predictable Democratic win. That's the actual story. The voting right is completely intact. The engineered outcome is what's gone. And the people screaming the loudest aren't screaming because Black Tennesseans lost the right to vote. They're screaming because Democrats lost a near guaranteed congressional seat. And those two things are not the same. Now that I broke that down, I want you guys to check out the clips. I want you guys to also brace your ears, because I had to brace my ears due to the loudness and horns actually taking place when it comes to individuals being at the Capitol in Tennessee. Again, sorry, family. You might want to lower your volume a little bit. So I think you guys get the gist. I mean, I play a little bit more. I don't really want to, bother your ears, but can you imagine the politicians, all the individuals that's trying to actually go through with the process, the legal process, and possibly having ear damage because of how loud that horn was? Like, I'm watching it through the screen, and it's like I had to brace my ears. When I had my darn AirPods in and I came across this, I don't even know where they at right now. But you guys get my point. All right. Now, let's talk about what happened inside this Capitol, as you guys already seen the first clip inside the Capitol building, because the response to this map change is its own story worth understanding carefully. Protesters showed up, as you guys seen, to the Tennessee State Capitol and didn't just rally outside with signs. They came inside, filled the galleries and hallways, and generated enough noise that lawmakers on the floor reportedly couldn't hear each other speak, couldn't deliberate clearly, and struggled to conduct the actual vote. I want you guys to check this out.
Minutes.
These maps are racist tools of white supremacy at the behest of the most powerful white supremacist in the United States of America, Donald J. Trump. Memphis is the most beautiful place on the planet. It's the place that raised me, my brothers, my parents, my grandmothers, and where my ancestors' bones rest. And what you are doing today is eviscerating the only Black majority congressional district in our state because we are majority Black. We are here because this Republican Party has to seek to steal elections and seats because the president and the party have refused to address the pain, the suffering, and the struggling of everyday Tennesseans. This is about attacking, targeting, and cracking District 9 into pieces for more political and racial dominance and white supremacy in the state of Tennessee. And we need to realize that the Calais decision that you all are basing your decisions off of, that gutted the Voting Rights Act, that Voting Rights Act was paid in blood. It was not just a parchment of paper signed into law. It was paid in blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Paid in blood by Medgar Evers, paid in blood by Fannie Lou Hamer. It's been paid in blood year over year, time after time.
You don't walk out by yourself. Move the back. Boy!
Yeah, let Pearson go. Let Pearson go.
What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Ted. You stupid mother.
Yeah, so you guys get the gist. Sorry for the profanity. That was very unprofessional. But they came inside, they filled the galleries and the hallways, generated enough noise as you guys seen throughout the clips. Even spoke a bit, and a lot of profanity, a lot of tension, and days of this, not hours, days. And the moment you describe it that plainly, a question should come up for you naturally. Is that protected free speech, or is that something else entirely? Because those two things are genuinely different. And the difference has real legal meaning. Free speech in America is one of the most protected rights we have, and it should be. You can show up to a government building, you can hold signs, organize rallies, chant on the steps, and speak directly to your representatives. You can make your position loud and impossible to ignore. That is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Civic participation is supposed to be uncomfortable sometimes. It's supposed to apply pressure. Nobody's arguing against that. But here's what the line is. Imagine you're a referee at a basketball game and the crowd gets so loud you literally cannot hear the coach call a timeout or the buzzer signal the end of a quarter. At some point, the game cannot function. That's not the crowd exercising free speech anymore. That's the crowd shutting the game down entirely. And when the noise level inside a legislative chamber reaches the point where elected officials cannot hear the debate, cannot process the arguments being made, and cannot cast an informed vote, that crosses from expression into interference with a government function. Most states have laws covering exactly that. So the question of why those laws weren't applied here why nobody was removed or charged is genuinely worth sitting with. And here's the consistency test that cuts through all the political noise every single time. Flip the script completely. Imagine a group of conservative protesters showing up to the California state capitol or the New York state legislature. Same behavior, same sustained noise, same days-long disruption of an active legislative session. What happens? Not in theory, but based on the actual patterns we watched play out over the last several years in this country. What realistically happens? The coverage lands nationally within hours. The arrests come fast. The word insurrection gets floated before the end of the first news cycle. Some of those characterizations might even be fair because disrupting the legislative process is serious regardless of who does it or why they believe they're justified. The point isn't to pick a side on the noise itself. The point is that accountability has to travel in both directions or it stops being accountability and becomes something more like a selective enforcement. And when people watch selective enforcement operate long enough, they stop trusting the institutions doing the enforcing. That erosion doesn't belong to one political party. It lands on everybody because all of us depend on those institutions functioning with some level of fairness and consistency to keep daily life from becoming completely unpredictable. What makes this particular situation even more telling is the specific context underneath it. The law was followed. A Supreme Court ruling came down. The state legislature acted on that ruling using authority they were legally granted. The protesters weren't objecting to a law being broken. They were objecting to a law being followed. That's a meaningful distinction. And it's one the coverage of this story walked right past without blinking.
News right now coming out of Tennessee. That state has now redrawn its congressional maps and no longer includes what would be considered a majority black district. The rush to chisel out that majority black district comes as the direct result of the Supreme Court decision to severely limit the Voting Rights Act. The conservative majority ruling that states cannot overly rely on race to draw its congressional maps, and Tennessee followed suit. Scripps News senior congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed joins us now. And Nate, they passed this new map despite really some fervent protests there.
That's right. But ultimately, Republicans had the support they needed to do this. And they have that critical trifecta in the state of Tennessee. They control the state house. They control the state Senate. They control the governor's mansion. And for that reason, they can pretty much do what they want here. There have been those protests. I'm glad you mentioned them. Our partners at Scripps News Nashville have been all over some of those protests in recent days. But the reality was here, they could redraw Tennessee's 9th congressional district because they simply had the support to do so. That district currently represented by Congressman Steve Cohen, a longtime Democrat, someone who's become relatively prominent on Capitol Hill. He's known in part for the vintage automobile that he drives around with a campaign poster. I've driven home next to him before. But the Tennessee State House choosing to take this step in the wake of that Supreme Court decision, which effectively gave these states broad berth to do so, more or less saying that they wouldn't enforce certain parts of the Voting Rights Act, which would, previously have limited their ability to slice up these majority-minority districts. For that reason, Republican state legislatures across the country have been trying to take this opportunity to carve out more Republican-leaning districts, especially in red states where there is the critical trifecta. The state house, state assembly, in some cases, the state senate, and the governor's mansion, all controlled by Republicans. The goal here, again, to try and give Republicans a bit of a leg up in the midterm elections. Democrats have been trying to fight fire with fire. We saw, of course, the redistricting in Virginia, that 10-to-1 map. Just yesterday, the offices of the Virginia Senate President Pro Tem being raided by the feds, leading to a lot of speculation, with not much evidence about political retribution there. Again, no indication that this redistricting, despite how close we are to the elections, by the way, less than 6 months away, is going away anytime soon. It's already upending elections. Louisiana, for example, they pressed pause on their party primaries to give the lawmakers in Baton Rouge more time to redraw the lines.
And Steve Cohen, by the way, describing himself as a white guy who represents Memphis, Tennessee. But we also talked about that domino effect as because of the Supreme Court decision. Tell me what happens next.
Well, other states are going to be looking into this as well. And, we reported about some of them earlier this week. Mississippi, Louisiana, there's a whole lot of other states. There's also Florida, which has taken some recent moves to draw up some other districts. That kind of was put into motion a bit before the Supreme Court came down with that ruling. But again, there's a real desire here, Del, among Republican governors to try and benefit Republicans as much as possible in the midterm elections. Democrats, it's worth noting, have tried to do this as well in as many states as possible. It almost seems like a bit of a, and pardon my colloquialism here, a race to the bottom in terms of how many state legislatures can carve up as many districts as possible. Even in the state of New York, again, heavily Democratic state, at least on the statewide level. There was Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, sending a delegation from D.C. to try and meet with the state Senate President Pro Tem and state officials there, including Governor Kathy Hochul, to see if Democrats could redraw the lines to favor themselves in that state. Something they've tried before, by the way, which has been blocked in the courts. Obviously, a lot of questions about whether the courts intervene this time, but clearly a lot of Republicans in state legislatures and Republican governors kind of taking what the Supreme Court said last week as a more of a green light than a yellow light in terms of what they could do to carve up these districts.
Final question before I let you go. Not all redrawing, though, is equal.
All right, family. So with that being said, so let's get into the argument itself, because this is where the whole debate collapses under its own logic, and I want to walk through it slowly enough that nobody misses it. Democratic lawmakers and protesters standing inside and outside that Capitol building called the new Tennessee maps racist tools of white supremacy, quote unquote. That's a direct quote from the floor. And I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not dismissing the emotion behind those words. Memphis is a city with deep roots, real history, and real community pride. The people speaking felt genuinely connected to that place and what it represents. That's real and it matters. But the argument itself falls apart the moment you examine it honestly. And examine it honestly is exactly what we're going to do right now. If racism means sorting people, judging people, or making political decisions about people based on their race, then a congressional district that was deliberately drawn around the racial composition of his residents or makeup of his residents is, by that exact same definition, a race-based political decision. You cannot hold both positions simultaneously. You cannot say stop seeing people by race while also saying these district lines must be drawn according to race. That is a direct logical contradiction, and it doesn't become less of a contradiction because one side has more emotional intensity behind it. A circle cannot be a square no matter how loudly someone insists otherwise. Now, here's the history that almost never gets mentioned in these conversations, and it's the piece that reframes everything. The civil rights movement, the actual movement, the one led by people like John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Medgar Evers, the very people being invoked in those speeches at the Tennessee Capitol, fought for integration. They fought for colorblind America. The moral core of the entire movement was that sorting human beings by race for any purpose was fundamentally wrong. That was the argument. The dream wasn't race sorted geography or racially divided political maps. It was that the content of your character would carry more weight than the color of your skin. Who have said that? Martin Luther King. Full stop. That was the vision those people bled for on that bridge. Majority minority districts came later, introduced specifically as a remedial tool to counteract documented patterns of vote dilution in areas where local governments were deliberately cracking black communities apart to drain their political influence. To be clear, that was a real documented problem. And the response made sense at that time. I'm going to say it again. The remedial tool, the tool to fix, to counteract the documented patterns of basically weakening the vote in areas where local governments were cracking, meaning they were spreading apart black communities to drain where their vote wouldn't matter, because if you spread black votes out, then obviously it wouldn't have much of an impact to even, to have someone be representing them or those communities representing them, because they're spread out across districts where the vote won't have that much pull to fully be effective to represent whoever they want to represent, that community. So to be clear, that was a real documented problem, and the response made sense at that time back then. If someone is intentionally breaking your community into pieces to silence you politically, drawing a protective boundary around that community is a reasonable counter move. Back then, nobody was arguing that the original intent was wrong. But here's what happened over decades. That remedial tool got stretched far beyond what the architects of the Voting Rights Act ever intended it to be. It stopped being a shield against suppression and became something closer to a permanent reservation system for one political party. A seat drawn to mathematically unwinnable for any opponent isn't representation anymore. It's a guaranteed contract. And guaranteed contracts don't produce hustle. They produce comfort. So here's the honest question that this whole situation forces onto the table. If black voters in Tennessee broke heavily Republican instead of heavily Democratic, would the Democratic Party be fighting anywhere near this hard to preserve a majority black district? Think about that carefully. Would the same lawmakers invoking civil rights history on that floor be demanding the racial makeup of that district to be protected if the political math ran in the other direction? Meaning the other party doing what they're doing right now. You already know the answer. Everyone in that room knows the answer. And the answer tells you everything about what this fight is actually about. And if you still need proof that this is about party power and not about community outcomes, look at the numbers coming out the 9th district itself. Memphis residents have a median household income of $53,748 compared to $67,631 across the rest of Tennessee. The poverty rate inside that district sits at 20.8%, while the statewide average is 14%. The violent crime rate in Memphis runs at roughly 2,501 incidents per 100,000 people, which is nearly 7 times the national average. Only about 25% of adults in the district hold a bachelor's degree. Those are not statistics from a community that has been thriving under its current political representation. That district has been held by the same party, drawn specifically to guarantee them that seat for decades. And those are the results. So when protesters flood a state capitol screaming that this map must be preserved, the honest follow-up question is, preserved from whom? Preserved for whom? Because by every measurable outcome that actually affects how people live, eat, stay safe, and educate their kids, the existing system has not been delivering. Fighting to lock that system in permanently is not fighting for the people of Memphis, it's fighting for the politicians who have benefited from representing them without having to compete for it. Black representation in Congress means Black Americans have someone in that chamber speaking directly to their lived reality, their economic pressures, their community-specific concerns. And take it a step further, it don't matter what race. A representative elected represents those communities, that communities or the community-specific concerns. A guaranteed Democratic seat means a political party retains a predictable win on a map. Those two outcomes can overlap, but they are not the same thing. Treating them as identical is exactly how a power preservation argument gets dressed up in civil rights language. The people of Memphis deserve a representative who has to earn, based on merit, qualities, character, not the color of their skin, their vote. Earn their vote every single cycle, not one who already knows they can't lose before the campaign even begins. After the vote passed and the new maps were locked in, one of the Democratic lawmakers who had been speaking on that floor invoking civil rights history and calling these maps tools of white supremacy walked up to a state trooper, as you guys seen, and called them a pig. Used profanity directly at him. This is the situation I'm talking about. Used profanity directly at him on camera in a public government building. And I want to handle this carefully because the point I'm making here is not a character attack on that individual lawmaker. People get emotional when they lose a political fight they genuinely care about or cared about. That's human. Emotions don't always produce measured responses in high pressure moments, and I'm not here to pretend otherwise. But the point is about what happens next, or more accurately, what didn't happen next, because we have to ask the question that the coverage of this story almost completely avoided. If the rows in that hallway that you guys see on this screen right now were reversed, what follows? And I hate to be, white and black, but if that state trooper who happens to be white, and the man who is running off of the white supremacy and brought up history that I broke down for you with the civil rights and all that. So if the roles were reversed and the state trooper approached him, the lawmaker, Representative Justin Pearson, in that same charged moment and used comparable language and called him a boy, cursed directly at him, got in his face while cameras were rolling, what does that story look like by the following morning? You don't have to speculate. You watch this pattern enough times to know exactly how it plays out. It's national by midnight. It leads every broadcast the next day. There are press conferences, calls for immediate termination, demands for federal review, and that officer's career ends before the week is out. That's not speculation. That's a documented pattern with enough examples behind it to be treated as a predictable outcome. So why did this specific incident get swallowed up in a larger story and barely get examined on its own terms? That question matters because the answer reveals something about how accountability actually functions in our current media environment. And it's not a comfortable answer for anyone paying attention, honestly. The standard for what counts as offensive, what counts as newsworthy, and what counts as deserving of consequence appears to shift depending on who's involved. And when the standard shifts based on who's involved rather than what actually happened, it stops being a standard. It becomes a preference. Those are two completely different things. Now, I want to be direct here because this is where people sometimes want to make this conversation about race, and that's actually the wrong frame. This isn't about which race gets more protection or more privilege in any broad philosophical sense. This is specifically about institutional consistency through this whole video. Courts are supposed to apply the same law to the same conduct, regardless of who's standing in front of the bench. News organizations are supposed to apply the same scrutiny to the same behavior, regardless of which team benefits. Law enforcement is supposed to enforce the same rules on the same actions, regardless of who's performing them. So when any of those institutions visibly fails that consistency test, it doesn't just damage trust in that institution. It sends a signal to everyone watching that the rules are negotiable. And negotiable rules aren't rules at all. So think about how this plays out in everyday life. Any teacher who disciplines one student for talking in class and ignores the same behavior from another student doesn't just lose credibility with the two students involved. They lose credibility with every student in that room who witnessed it. Everyone knows the rules aren't really the rules. Everyone adjusts their behavior accordingly. Institutions work exactly the same way, just at a much larger scale with much higher stakes. And the Tennessee Capitol incident was a small moment in a big story. But small moments with visible double standards have a way of teaching the public exactly what kind of system they're actually living in. So Tennessee is not a standalone event. That framing is exactly how stories like this get contained and dismissed before the full picture comes into focus. Louisiana paused its party primaries to give lawmakers more time to redraw district lines. Mississippi is working through the same process. Florida moved on its districts before the Supreme Court ruling even formally landed. Virginia attempted a 10-to-1 map that drew federal attention for reasons that had nothing to do with racial composition, and it got struck down today by Virginia's own Supreme Court. And it can't go further to SCOTUS, as in the Supreme Court over there and the judicial branch up there near Congress and so forth. Because once your own state Supreme Court knocks it down, that's it. Because SCOTUS is just going to say the same answer. So this is a coordinated nationwide redistricting wave happening simultaneously across multiple states, and Tennessee just happened to produce the loudest room when it did. And here's the part that should matter to anyone trying to think about this honestly, regardless of party affiliation. Democrats are running the exact same strategic playbook wherever they control the levers of the state government. Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, personally dispatched a delegation to New York, or a conversation in New York, to meet with state officials and push to redraw maps that would benefit Democrats heading into the midterm. Same calculation, same motivation, same goal of converting geographic lines into predictable seat counts. Nobody flooded the Albany State House over that, and nobody called it an attack on democracy or a tour of racial dominance. So the outrage isn't about the practice of redrawing maps. It's entirely about which party loses ground when the lines move. Both parties have used redistricting as a weapon. That's a documented fact, not a partisan talking point. And pretending otherwise doesn't make this analysis more honest. It makes it less useful. But only one side in this specific story is being held to the standard of a Supreme Court ruling, and only one side is being labeled racist for complying with it. That gap between what actually happened and how it's being described is where a lot of people's trust in political coverage quietly dies. So the deeper problem underneath all of this is what guaranteed districts produce over a long enough timeline. When a seat is engineered to be guaranteed, the politician holding it becomes accountable to party leadership and donor relationships rather than the people back home. Their job security stops depending on whether the neighborhood got safer, whether the grocery bill went down, or whether the schools improve, and it depends on showing up to the right rooms in Washington and keeping the right people satisfied. Competitive districts, the kind where a representative genuinely has to perform or face real consequences at the ballot box, or the actual mechanism that makes how can I put this? That makes representative democracy function. We are really a constitutional republic that's a form of democracy. So that's the way it's supposed to be. So if you remove the competition and you remove the accountability, and the constituents absorb the cost while the politician stays comfortable. The Supreme Court then erased black representation in Tennessee. It removed the guarantee that one party gets to skip the competition entirely. Black voters in Memphis still cast ballots. Their voices still carry weight in the outcome. What ended is the engineered portion of the system that was designed to make the result predictable before anyone walked into a booth to cast their vote. That's not a civil rights loss. That's a return to what elections were always supposed to be. Fighting for race-based maps in 2026 is not a civil rights position. It's a power protection position wearing civil rights language. And that distinction matters because one of those things serve voters and the other one serves politicians, right? And now I want to show you guys this CNN clip before I close, but I had to make distinctions because I just wanted you guys to understand the simple fact that there's a lot of things that are being misled and narratives to benefit whoever wants to spew the narrative. So this is the CNN panel talking about Memphis and talking about basically the congressional seat after Tennessee. So I want you guys to hear it and I'll break it down.
The woman now who is likely going to win the 9th district in Tennessee is a black Republican woman as a result of this redistricting effort. It's likely going to be a black Republican woman who beats that old white man.
Could I make this very simple
But that's
point?
racist?
We're going to come back.
It actually is.
We're going to take a quick break, and then Tesla and Congressman, I'm going to have you both respond. We'll be right back.
I'd be Phillips always go on break when the facts about to come out. But anyway, the old white man that she's talking about is him. Right? These two. Side by side. Steve Cohen. He's Jewish. And then you got Charlotte Bergman. She's a black Republican. Now, why, Key, do you mention this? Steve Cohen is a Democratic congressman for Tennessee's 9th Congressional District, which is the Memphis area U.S. House seat. He was first elected to Congress in 2006 and has served in the U.S. House from 2007 till now, meaning he has been in his seat for almost 20 years. His own congressional biography says he served Tennessee's 9th district since 2006. And the public office section lists him in the U.S. House from 2007 to present. Now, the race people are talking about is not a mayor race, not a governor race, and not a Senate race. It is the race for one seat in the United States House of Representatives. Tennessee's 9th Congressional District, the seat currently represents Memphis and surrounding areas in the Memphis area, which is communities. So every 2 years, voters choose who goes to Washington, D.C. to represent that district in Congress. So now, the controversy is about redistricting, meaning Tennessee changed the congressional map. I broke all that down in the beginning of this video. So the old 9th district was Memphis-based majority black, heavily Democratic district. Tennessee Republicans passed a new map that breaks up that district and spreads Memphis voters across Republican-leaning districts. Democrats and civil rights groups say this weakens black voting power. Republicans say the old map protected Democratic power, which I broke down, where it only helped keep Democrats in power, positions of power, like Stephen Cohen, who's been in the same seat for 20 plus years. So now, when you look at that, right? And by the way, this is what the Associated Press reported, that Tennessee's new map dismantles the Memphis-based majority black district and favors Republican interests ahead of the 2026 midterms. Now, the Steve Cohen point is this. If Democrats call it a black congressional district, critics can respond by saying, then why is it being represented by a white Democrat for nearly 20 years? That does not mean Steve Cohen is illegitimate. Voters chose him. But it does challenge the talking point that the district automatically equals black representation. And if you look at it, a more accurate argument because I'm looking at it from all angles objectively, the district has been a Democratic power base with a large black voter population, not necessarily a guaranteed black represented seat, because obviously you see Steve Cohen is not black. Now, on the right, the woman with the red suit, Charlotte Bergman, when you look at that, she's a black Republican who has ran for the same Tennessee 9th District seat multiple times, including against Steve Cohen. So when you look at that, Democrats are defending the district as black representation, but when a black Republican woman ran for that same seat, party politics mattered more than racial identity. So that shows the fight is not only about race, it is also about which party controls the seat, possibly, right? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. So when you look at it, right, Cohen and the Democratic aligned forces have had a major fundraising and political advantage over Bergman, the black Republican here on the screen. For example, now this is me just looking at the records because I did my research. This is basically FEC, which means the Federal Election Admission records show Cohen's 2026 campaign had raised about $658,568 and spent about $395,281 through March 31st, 2026. While Bergman's 2026 campaign has raised about $11,735 and spent about $7,446 in the same period. Right? So I'm explaining in plain English. This race is about Tennessee's 9th Congressional District. The Memphis area seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Steve Cohen, a white Democrat, has held the seat for nearly 20 plus years. That matters because Democrats are now saying Republicans are taking away a black congressional district. But the district has not been represented by a black member of Congress for the last 2 decades. It has been represented by Steve Cohen. So the fair question is, are Democrats defending black representation or are they defending a safe Democratic seat? AKA handouts. I'm just being objective. I'm not saying this is my perspective. I'm just saying what critics are saying. So now when you look at it from that standpoint, Charlotte Bergman, the black Republican woman, has run for this seat multiple times because she's a Republican. Democrats did not treat her as the black representation. They now claim to be protecting, quote unquote, black representation. Let me reiterate. That is a contradiction here. And that's what the CNN clip was referring to. When she said white old man, she was talking about Steve, and then she talked about the black Republican running. They were talking about Charlotte Bergman, who I'm showing you guys a picture of them side by side on the screen. So, the Supreme Court point is that race should not be used as permanent political tool to lock in power for one party. If a district is drawn mainly around race and the practical result is protecting one party's person for almost 20 years to remain in that seat, then people have a right to question whether that is real representation or political protection. So black voters deserve fair representation, but no political party owns black voters. And no district should be protected forever just because it helps one party stay in power. But with all that being said, I know there's a lot to digest. I hope I broke it down in simplistic terms so you guys get my drift. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Drop a comment telling me whether you think the district should be drawn by geography and community interest or by racial composition. Because I generally want to see where people land. I might put a poll down in the comments below, but subscribe if you want more plain English breakdowns of the stories the media makes more complicated than it need to be. Catch you next one. Spread that peace, love, and positivity. Let the love supersede the hate. As always, we just having a conversation. Peace.